As the story begins, people who knew Emily described the connection between her and Joseph as something almost magnetic, like the two of them were pulled together on the same strange wavelength, the kind of bond that feels intense and exciting. In the beginning, the kind that makes a young woman believe she's found something rare. And that's exactly how it felt as their first wedding anniversary approached. There was anticipation building, excitement about getting away for a quiet weekend, a chance to celebrate 1 year of marriage together in a camper van they had lovingly fixed up themselves. It was supposed to be simple and romantic. Candles, music, fresh mountain air, the peaceful solitude of Vermont's forests. But before that weekend was over, everything would unravel in a way no one could have imagined. Because soon, the question would no longer be about celebrating love. It would be about finding Emily. When the first report came in that she was missing, the people closest to her had only one thought racing through their minds. Where is Emily? What happened to her? Did something terrible happen inside that camper? Did she run away after a fight? Or did someone take her life? At that moment, no one knew the answers, and the uncertainty was almost unbearable. The truth, when it finally surfaced, would shock even seasoned investigators. One official later described the case as something far beyond what they normally see in homicide investigations, a situation so extreme it crossed into what they call overkill. But before anyone knew that, the story started in a quiet place. This one begins with a married couple heading into the woods of Vermont for what should have been a peaceful anniversary escape. The setting was the small mountain town of Bolton, Vermont, a scenic resort community where just over 1,000 residents live among forests and ski slopes, the kind of place where people expect quiet weekends and friendly neighbors. On December 15, 2021, Joseph Ferlazzo and his wife Emily Ferlazzo arrived there to celebrate 1 year of marriage. For them, the trip carried extra excitement. It was the very first journey in their newly renovated camper van, a project they had spent time restoring together. Emily had another reason to be excited as well. After a year of marriage, she was finally going to meet Joseph's sister, Nikki, for the first time. Emily had been looking forward to that moment, hoping to feel closer to Joseph's family. Joseph himself worked as a tattoo artist in nearby Burlington, Vermont, where he had built a reputation for his work over the years. He and Emily had originally met in Vermont before eventually moving to New Hampshire, where they were staying with Emily's parents. Their relationship had always stood out because of the large age difference. Joseph was in his 40s, while Emily was still in her 20s. But friends say that didn't seem to matter to her. Emily was described as bright, warm, and energetic, someone who loved singing and making people laugh. Professionally, she worked as a licensed nurse assistant, the kind of job that reflects a natural instinct to care for others. And she also dreamed of becoming a cosmetologist one day. People around her often wondered what exactly drew her so strongly to Joseph, but there was no denying that she felt deeply connected to him. So when the couple arrived at the Bolton Valley Resort area and parked near the Bear Run condos, it looked like the start of a pleasant weekend. They briefly met up with Nikki and her boyfriend, who were staying in an Airbnb nearby, before returning to their camper van for the night. The plan was simple. They'd reconnect later, maybe watch a movie together or spend time catching up. But something happened that evening that shifted the mood. Emily realized that those same Bear Run condos were connected to Joseph's past, that he had once lived there with his ex-wife, and that the ex-wife was still living in the complex. Learning that seemed to shake Emily deeply. What began as an anniversary trip suddenly turned tense. Investigators later learned that an argument took place that night inside the camper van, though the exact details of what was said may never be fully known. By the next morning, the story Joseph told people was already changing. On Saturday morning, he went out to breakfast with Nikki and her boyfriend at a restaurant in Waterbury, Vermont, explaining that Emily had stayed behind because she wasn't feeling well and was still sleeping. Later, they returned to the condos briefly before Joseph drove the camper north to visit friends, the Lang family, in St. Albans, Vermont. The day unfolded as if everything were normal. Joseph even gave his sister the tattoo he had promised. Her and everyone spent time socializing. But as the hours passed, Joseph offered a new explanation about Emily. According to him, they had argued the night before, and she had decided to take an Uber back to New Hampshire on her own. That version of events seemed unusual, but at the time, no one had proof otherwise. Later that night, Joseph and his friends went out for dinner and drinks before returning to the house, while Nikki went back to the condo where she was staying. Then, Joseph did something else that would later raise serious questions. He drove all the way to Emily's parents' home in New Hampshire, acting surprised when she wasn't there. He told them the same story, that they'd had a fight, and he assumed she had gone home ahead of him. But Emily's parents immediately sensed something was wrong. Their daughter was normally in constant contact with them, texting, calling, staying active on social media. Suddenly, she was completely silent. No phone activity, no messages, no explanation. That kind of disappearance was completely out of character for Emily, and it set off alarm bells. Her stepfather, David Bass, decided he couldn't ignore the feeling that something terrible might have happened. He contacted the Vermont State Police, and Trooper Cody took the call. As he listened carefully to the details, small clues started standing out, details that didn't quite add up. Almost immediately, the trooper felt that something about Joseph's story didn't sit right, and that instinct would lead him to make a phone call that marked the real beginning of the investigation, because the next step was to contact Joseph Ferlazzo directly and start asking questions that might finally reveal what really happened during that anniversary weekend in the Vermont woods. In the hours after Emily vanished, the situation began to unfold through a series of small conversations and observations. Details that might not have meant much on their own, but together started to form a troubling picture. When investigators first spoke with Joseph Ferlazzo, his explanation seemed simple on the surface. According to him, he and his wife, Emily Ferlazzo, had argued during their anniversary trip near Bolton, Vermont, and Emily had decided she wanted to leave. He told police that she asked him to drop her off in a parking lot so she could order an Uber and head back toward New Hampshire. When Trooper Cody asked him where exactly he had dropped her off, Joseph offered vague answers, insisting that she simply walked away and he assumed she had found a ride. To some investigators, that story might have been enough to start a routine missing person report and wait for further developments. But Trooper Cody sensed something wasn't right. Instead of stopping there, he started asking deeper questions that very first night. Joseph claimed that the camper van the couple had traveled in had broken down somewhere down south at a garage. But when the trooper began verifying that information, the story quickly fell apart. He contacted friends of Joseph, the Lang family in St. Albans, Vermont, and they told him something very different. The camper van wasn't at a garage at all. It was sitting right there in their driveway. That single contradiction immediately raised alarm bells. Trooper Cody contacted the nearby barracks of the Vermont State Police, asking officers to go to the Lang's home and look for Emily. When troopers arrived, They performed an initial search of the camper van parked outside. At that point, they didn't find Emily inside, but the circumstances already felt suspicious. For Emily's family, the situation was becoming more frightening by the hour. The only thing anyone knew for certain was that she was missing and completely out of contact with everyone who loved her. Those closest to her kept asking the same questions. Where is Emily? Is she safe? Did she simply leave after an argument? Or did something far more serious happen inside that camper van during the anniversary trip? No one had answers yet, and that uncertainty hung over the investigation. Meanwhile, Joseph continued moving around as if nothing unusual had happened. On Sunday night, he drove his Jeep to the home of a friend named Spencer Lemons and asked for a ride. Joseph told Spencer he needed to go back to the Lang family's house to pick up his camper van. Spencer agreed without thinking much of it, assuming he was simply helping a friend retrieve a vehicle. The two of them started driving along Route 36 toward the Lang property. But as they got closer to the house, Spencer noticed something strange. Police cars were already there. Multiple officers surrounded the property. Confused, Spencer called 911 from his phone while still in the car. He told the dispatcher that he had been driving Joseph to pick up his bus and suddenly realized police were everywhere at the destination. In that moment, everything changed. According to Spencer, Joseph suddenly turned to him and said something that stopped him cold. Joseph admitted he had done something terrible. When Spencer asked what he meant, Joseph allegedly said he had killed his wife. Spencer later described the moment in disbelief, saying it felt like something out of a bad movie. Joseph reportedly told him that Emily was dead and that her body was inside a box in the camper van. Spencer asked the question anyone would ask in that moment. Is she alive? Joseph answered no. Then he begged Spencer to turn the car around and get him away from the police. Spencer refused. Instead, he pulled over and told Joseph to get out of the vehicle because he was calling the police immediately. Spencer later explained that he had a family at home and didn't want anything to do with a situation like that. Joseph did not fight him. He simply stepped out of the car and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. That night, Joseph apparently hid in a shed, avoiding authorities while the investigation intensified. But the following day, his attempt to stay hidden came to an unexpected end. Trooper Amy Nolan of the Vermont State Police was on patrol when she noticed a man walking slowly through the parking lot of a convenience store. It was a cool October day, and the man wore a hood, something that didn't immediately stand out. Nolan waited as he crossed the lot and entered the store, and then she and another trooper followed inside. The man walked to a drink cooler. As he reached inside to grab something, he turned slightly and glanced back toward the trooper. Their eyes met. Then he turned again while moving away from the cooler and looked back a second time. In that instant, recognition hit. The man standing a few feet away from her wasn't just a random customer. It was Joseph Ferlazzo, the same man investigators had been urgently searching for in connection with Emily's disappearance. And with that moment of eye contact inside a quiet convenience store, the case that had begun with a missing person mystery was about to take a dramatic and irreversible turn. When Trooper Amy Nolan finally spotted Joseph Ferlazzo that crisp October morning in the convenience store parking lot, the weight of the search seemed almost palpable, like the air itself had thickened with anticipation. Every instinct screaming that something horrific had occurred. And yet nothing in that moment fully prepared her for the grim confession that was about to unfold. Joseph, moving slowly, hood pulled tight over his head, clutching a drink in one hand, gave the casual appearance of an ordinary man going about an ordinary day. But as their eyes met, a flicker of recognition ignited. And in that split second, a veil lifted to reveal the terrible truth, the story hidden behind the missing woman, the one who had vanished seemingly without a trace. His wife Emily, a vibrant young woman in her 20s, full of life, laughter, and warmth, whose very presence had illuminated every room she entered. And now, according to the man himself, was gone forever. Her life snatched in an instant by the person sworn to love and protect her, the husband she had celebrated a single year of marriage with, the man who had promised partnership, companionship, and the tender care of a shared life. And as Trooper Nolan approached, calling out, "State Police, stop for a second. I'd like to talk to you." Ferlazzo paused, the weight of inevitability settling across his shoulders like a shroud. And in a moment of stark vulnerability, he set down his drink, deflating as though the very act of standing upright had become unbearable, his shoulders slumping and eyes clouding with a mixture of fatigue, guilt, and something almost imperceptibly human beneath the facade of detachment. And with a quiet, tremulous voice, he admitted, almost before a question could be posed, "No, I'm not okay." The words barely escaping his lips, yet resonating with the heavy finality of a confession that would ripple through families, communities, and investigators alike. And as he allowed himself to be led toward the patrol car, speaking softly, "Let's go," when asked where, his response, "Wherever you're taking me," was both chilling in its simplicity and revealing in its compliance. A man resigned to the inevitability of accountability, yet still tethered to a shadowy sense of fear, not for what he had done, but for the consequences that awaited. And as the ride to the barracks commenced, every mile a stretch through morale and psychological terrain both treacherous and revealing, Ferlazzo began to recount the weekend, beginning with their journey to Vermont, the idyllic promise of a romantic getaway that had quickly twisted into something nightmarish, detailing their time in the camper, the carefully arranged candles and music intended to celebrate their anniversary, the pretense of normalcy masking, the simmering tension, the argument that had erupted between them as Emily discovered unsettling truths about Joseph's past, and the cascade of events that had led to his irreversible action. A moment when, according to him, her behavior became completely psychotic, and with the eerie calm of someone narrating events long past, he described reaching for his Glock, a pistol equipped with a suppressor, and firing not once, but twice, directly into the heart of the woman who had once shared his life. The casualness with which he spoke about these actions, chilling investigators who had long trained to witness trauma, but rarely with such unflinching, emotionless narrative from the perpetrator. And as he described her laying down, as if surrendering to the inevitable, the careful placement of a trash bag over her head and bloodied body, the purported cleanup, the anxiety attack that followed. It was a scene that defied ordinary comprehension, where domesticity and horror collided in a way that left even seasoned law enforcement officers momentarily suspended in disbelief. And as he recounted every detail from her punches and kicks, unsubstantiated by physical evidence on his body, to the cold efficiency of his actions, investigators painstakingly recorded, photographed, and cataloged every word and gesture, knowing that this confession, raw and complete, was both a key to understanding Emily's final moments and a grim testament to the darkness that can lurk behind familiar faces. And as Trooper Nolan watched, every carefully trained sense on high alert. She recognized that the procedural steps, identifying the firearm, cataloging injuries, confirming the narrative, were not merely formalities, but the very threads that would weave together a legal case that could bring justice, while also serving as a harrowing reminder of the fragile boundary between love and violence, passion and destruction. And as Ferlazzo described the aftermath, the panic, the decision-making, the surreal calm with which he recounted his actions, one could almost feel the room's air thicken, heavy with the weight of moral reckoning, while the investigators maintained their composure, balancing empathy, professional detachment, and the relentless pursuit of truth, knowing that in the days and weeks to follow, the facts he provided would be cross-examined, verified, and scrutinized, ultimately shaping the narrative that would define not just the legal proceedings, but the memory of Emily herself, a bright, ambitious young woman whose life ended far too soon, and yet whose story, preserved in painstaking detail through witness statements, forensic evidence, and confessions like Ferlazzo's, would continue to resonate. A stark illustration of the catastrophic consequences when domestic tension escalates to violence, the fragility of trust, and the imperative for vigilance, empathy, and justice in the face of unfathomable human behavior, making this moment the calm, almost casual admission in a parking lot, the fulcrum upon which the investigation pivoted, the undeniable turning point where questions became answers, where concern became certainty, and where the story of Emily Ferlazzo, once lost to fear and uncertainty, began to emerge in stark, tragic clarity, setting in motion the meticulous work of law enforcement, forensic experts, and prosecutors. Each detail a step toward understanding, accountability, and the relentless pursuit of justice in a case that would captivate the nation and remind everyone who followed it that even the most ordinary-seeming lives can harbor unimaginable horror just beneath the surface. As investigators began to peel back the layers of Joseph Ferlazzo's confession, the grim reality of Emily's death became horrifyingly concrete, every detail more macabre than the last, as he described in chillingly calm and methodical terms exactly what he had done, recounting how he had not only killed his wife with a Glock pistol, but then taken deliberate, painstaking steps to conceal her body, placing her lifeless form into multiple trash bags, slicing it into smaller pieces, with a saw inside the very camper they had used to celebrate what should have been their first wedding anniversary. And as he spoke, detectives jotted notes feverishly, piecing together a timeline that could be cross-referenced with forensic evidence, GPS data, and witness testimony, knowing that every word he offered could make the difference between justice served and a murderer walking free. And yet, Ferlazzo remained eerily composed, his voice almost clinical as he explained the mechanics of the dismemberment, the cold pragmatism with which he wrapped the body, intending to dispose of it in the woods, a plan that now seemed both audacious and grotesquely meticulous. While outside the camper, Vermont's crisp autumn air belied the horror that had unfolded within, the quiet mountains and small-town streets offering a stark contrast to the brutality revealed inside the van, and when police entered the camper, they were met with the grim confirmation of his words. Stacks of trash bags consistent with human remains, bloodstains on the mattress and in the shower drain, cleaning supplies scattered as if he had attempted to erase every trace of Emily's existence, a saw still lying nearby, and, hauntingly, Emily's wedding ring resting among the clutter, its familiar shape immediately recognizable from photographs online, a symbol of life, love, and the shattered future he had stolen, and the presence of firearms within the camper, including the Glock he had confessed to using, added another layer of dread, as investigators struggled to comprehend the scale of premeditation and the cold detachment with which he had carried out the act, while forensic experts prepared to catalog, photograph, and process every item, knowing that the evidence would be critical to dismantling any defense that Joseph might attempt. And as the autopsy was conducted the next day, the horror deepened. 3 knives had been used to stab the remains of Emily 18 times, a level of violence that left even the most seasoned investigators shaken. A textbook example of overkill. Evidence not just of intent, but of rage, fear, and a disturbing need to assert control in the most horrific of ways. And as law enforcement processed the camper, documenting blood patterns, fiber transfers, and trace evidence, they were also grappling with the psychological profile of a man who could recount such brutality with near total emotional detachment, who could justify his actions with claims of fear and self-defense, yet meticulously plan every step of body, concealment, and dismemberment. And as they confronted him, the contrast between his calm demeanor and the unimaginable violence of his acts created an almost surreal tableau. The kind of case that challenges not just the limits of human empathy, but also the very methods of modern investigation. While in the courtroom, prosecutors faced the delicate task of translating this grotesque reality into a narrative that a jury could understand, ensuring that the emotional weight of Emily's death was balanced against cold, hard facts, and that Ferlazzo's confession, corroborated by physical evidence, could not be dismissed as mere fabrication or exaggeration. And as the trial approached, the legal team prepared meticulously, charting timelines, sequencing evidence, and rehearsing the presentation of a case, built on premeditation, deliberate action, and unambiguous intent, emphasizing that the killing was neither accidental nor spontaneous, that Joseph had acted willfully and with full knowledge of his actions, and that Emily's death was the inevitable result of choices he had made while the defense sought to cast doubt through claims of self-defense, portraying Emily as aggressive, volatile, and the immediate threat in the camper. A narrative intended to shift the focus from Joseph's deliberate planning to a supposed reactionary act, yet every piece of forensic evidence, from the saw, the blood patterns, the multiple trash bags, and the knives used in post-mortem stabbing, worked against this narrative, painting a picture of a calculated, methodical execution, a stark juxtaposition to the defense's portrayal, and as witnesses, including Joseph's sister Nikki, took the stand to recount the events of that fateful weekend. The jury was confronted not just with a crime scene, but with the chilling unraveling of a domestic life that had ended in unimaginable violence. The testimony describing the couple's initial excitement, the planned celebration, the camper, the shared wine and candles, all culminating in a sequence of aggression, fear, and, ultimately, murder. And as the state laid out the case, emphasizing Joseph's confession, the physical evidence in the camper, the autopsy findings, and the sequence of dismemberment, the narrative became clear. This was a crime of intention, of planning, and of execution, with no element of accident or spontaneous reaction. And yet, in the courtroom, the defense continued to insist that Joseph's actions had been justified by fear, citing statements he claimed Emily made, asserting that she had threatened him with a firearm, statements that prosecutors carefully deconstructed, highlighting inconsistencies, lack of physical corroboration for self-defense, and the overwhelming evidence of premeditation. And as the trial unfolded, every detail of the camper's interior, every bag, saw, and bloodstain became a pivotal piece of a puzzle. Each item a testament to Emily's life, her final moments, and the chilling precision of her husband's actions. All while the family, the community, and investigators grappled with the scope of the violence, the casual detachment of the perpetrator, and the legal challenge of ensuring that justice would be served. In a case that was as emotionally harrowing as it was legally complex, culminating in a meticulously prepared prosecution that sought to leave no room for doubt, that presented the facts of Emily's death, the confession, and the physical evidence in a way that left the jury with a clear understanding of the deliberate and premeditated nature of Joseph Ferlazzo's actions. And as the trial progressed, the narrative of horror, betrayal, and overkill unfolded with painstaking clarity, a stark reminder of how quickly life's celebrations can turn into tragedies, and how, in rare and horrifying instances, the domestic sphere can become the setting for acts of unimaginable violence, leaving a community, a family, and the criminal justice system to reckon with both the emotional and legal aftermath of a crime that defies ordinary comprehension. As the courtroom lights reflected off the polished surfaces and the jurors leaned forward, the tension was almost tangible. Every word uttered by witnesses and the accused carrying immense weight, and from the very beginning, the emotional gravity was clear. Emily's mother, appearing virtually on a screen at the side of the courtroom, visibly struggled to maintain composure, tears welling as she recounted the harrowing last days of her daughter's life and the uncharacteristic silence that had immediately alerted the family that something was wrong. And though she wasn't physically present, the emotional presence she conveyed resonated through the room, compelling every listener to bear witness not just to the facts, but to the human devastation wrought by Joseph Ferlazzo's actions. And the next day's testimony began to unravel the tragic timeline with painstaking specificity, as his sister Nikki recounted breakfast the morning after the incident, when Joseph, as she described, seemed outwardly normal, even calm, explaining that Emily had chosen to sleep in after a minor argument, giving no hint of the violent escalation that would soon unfold. And yet, beneath that facade, the darkness of what had occurred, and what was about to be revealed, was already seeping into every corner of the narrative, as investigators and prosecutors carefully documented tone, demeanor, and inconsistencies, aware that the devil was in the details, and that credibility could hinge on the smallest gestures, pauses, or omissions. And Emily's mother added a devastating layer, testifying about physical marks on her daughter's body, gouges across the chest, bruises on arms and thighs that Emily had offered partial explanations for, some attributed to a family dog, some to private matters, leaving investigators and jurors alike to wrestle with a haunting ambiguity. The reality of domestic intimacy and violence intersecting in ways that complicated the narrative and added weight to the prosecution's argument that the accused had acted with forethought and malice. While the defense's approach was strikingly sparse, calling only Joseph himself to the stand, and from the moment he began speaking, it was clear he was attempting to perform, to craft a version of events that preserved self-interest while deflecting culpability, projecting charm, confusion, and emotional vulnerability. As a means to sway perception, describing the early days of his relationship with Emily in almost poetic terms, emphasizing a magnetic connection, a shared wavelength, happiness, and emotional closeness, painting a picture of romantic harmony that starkly contrasted with the horrific actions for which he was on trial. And when pressed about the deterioration of their relationship, he claimed that Emily had become physically aggressive, that she had attacked him in fits of rage, that he had been forced to restrain her to prevent further harm, yet offered no evidence of any injuries sustained from these alleged assaults. And even as he recounted these claims, the jurors could see the contradictions, the implausibility, the carefully controlled tone masking an underlying agenda. And he further described the evening of the murder, the purported small gathering, with Nikki and her boyfriend, the lighting of candles, incense, drinks, and the escalating confrontation in which he claimed Emily had struck him with a candle, lunged, cursed, and thrown blows in a flurry of violence, his testimony attempting to frame the events as chaotic, reactionary, and self-defense oriented, while carefully avoiding acknowledgement of premeditation. And he continued, detailing the moment he allegedly climbed over Emily in bed, confronting her with the Glock he had pre-fitted with a suppressor, describing a final, brief, but decisive struggle in which he claimed she reached for a Taurus pistol hidden under her pillow, that she threatened him with the words, "That's it, you're dead," and that in response he fired. An account meant to suggest fear and instinctual reaction, yet layered with implausible elements. The suppressor, the preparation, the concealment of the weapons, and the prior arrangement of candles and incense, which prosecutors were quick to highlight as inconsistent with a narrative of sudden panic. And while he spoke, the courtroom felt a palpable tension, jurors leaning in, families suppressing sobs, the prosecution team ready to dismantle each assertion with physical evidence. Blood spatter patterns, forensic analysis of the camper, the dismemberment confirmed by autopsy, and the correspondence of weapon and ammunition to the crime scene, all pointing to deliberate, calculated acts rather than an impulsive defensive reaction. And as cross-examination probed further, Ferlazzo's story unraveled, with contradictions in timelines, the implausibility of a sudden, violent frenzy against the backdrop of measured actions, and the careful orchestration of concealment efforts, revealing a stark juxtaposition between his calm, almost rehearsed demeanor and the extreme violence documented by law enforcement. While testimony from family, friends, and first responders established context, Emily's personality, her character, the loving nature that made her vulnerable to manipulation, and the terror inflicted by the actions of someone she trusted. And as the defense's narrative of self-preservation hung in the air, the prosecution methodically reconstructed the events, from the initial arguments through the gathering with family to the moment of the shooting, using evidence, expert testimony, and forensic timelines to demonstrate the impossibility of Ferlazzo's version of fear-driven, reactive behavior, and the emotional impact on all involved. The mother, sister, friends, underscored the human cost behind the legal arguments, leaving the jury to grapple not only with the intricate details of the crime but with the full weight of its moral and emotional implications. As the court meticulously examined the tools of the murder, the Glock with suppressor, the Taurus allegedly threatened, the saw, the candles, the multiple trash bags, each item a piece of a puzzle demonstrating planning, intent, and methodical execution, a mosaic of overkill and cold calculation. While outside the courtroom, reporters and community members absorbed the unfolding details, the story resonating far beyond the small Vermont town, highlighting issues of domestic violence, manipulation, and premeditated murder. And throughout, the tension remained almost unbearable, the narrative oscillating between personal tragedy and forensic precision, leaving every listener with a chilling sense of the human cost behind the evidence as Joseph Ferlazzo, calm yet evasive, continued to testify, spinning his version of events in a delicate balance between self-interest and fabricated fear. While the prosecution readied each piece of evidence, each photograph, each forensic report, each witness statement, knowing that the ultimate task was to connect confession to physical evidence, narrative to reality, and actions to accountability, ensuring that when the jury retired to deliberate, they would have before them an unflinching, meticulously constructed account of not only what had occurred in that camper on October 15th and 16th, 2021, but also the degree of intentionality, the premeditated nature, and the overwhelming evidence of a violent act carried out with deliberate cruelty, and the courtroom, thick with tension, reflected the gravity of the case. A young woman's life brutally cut short, a community shaken, a family irreparably wounded, and a justice system tasked with parsing the truth from manipulation, fear, and fabrication, all converging in that single, horrifyingly detailed narrative of the final night of Emily Fazio's life, recounted by both the accused and those who knew her, a story of love twisted into violence, trust betrayed, and a deadly act meticulously documented, scrutinized, and ultimately weighed for the jury to render a verdict that would decide not only the fate of Joseph Ferlazzo, but also the memory, dignity, and justice owed to Emily. Fazio, the courtroom was heavy with anticipation as the final threads of testimony were drawn together, every juror, every attorney, and every family member present acutely aware of the gravity of what had unfolded over the preceding days. And even as the defense attempted to cast Joseph Ferlazzo as a man driven to desperate acts by perceived threats, the prosecution meticulously dismantled each of those claims, emphasizing the stark contrast between his initial detailed police confessions and the shifting narrative presented at trial, where Ferlazzo repeatedly invoked memory lapses, claiming, "I don't remember," as though the brutal murder and subsequent dismemberment of his young wife could somehow be erased from consciousness. And while he insisted that he had acted in self-defense, pointing to alleged slaps, kicks, and candle attacks, the evidence, or lack thereof, spoke to a premeditated and methodical sequence of events. No defensive wounds were found on him. There was no secondary firearm, no evidence Emily had threatened him with a gun, and every forensic finding, from blood spatter in the camper to the saw and knives used in dismemberment to the trash bags containing her remains, told the story of calculated, intentional, and merciless violence, a narrative that stood in sharp contrast to the picture he tried to paint. And as Deputy State Attorney Sally Adams stepped forward in cross-examination, her voice steady but imbued with the weight of moral authority, she pressed him on his inconsistencies, highlighting the stark contradictions between his on-the-scene police interview and his courtroom testimony, forcing him to confront the fact that he had fabricated elements, misremembered events, and, in the eyes of the law, lied repeatedly to obscure the truth. And at that moment, when Adams directly asked, "Mr. Fazio, we can agree that you lie," and he conceded, "Yes, I have. I have lied to people. You're lying today about everything." The room collectively absorbed the significance of that admission, a moment that crystallized the prosecution's argument that this was a man unwilling to take responsibility, whose ego and self-interest had propelled him to horrific acts. And in the closing arguments, the prosecution wove together every witness statement, every piece of physical evidence, and every timeline discrepancy, painting a clear and horrifying portrait. Emily, a vibrant, young woman of 22, had attempted to disengage from a relationship that was turning toxic, lying peacefully in bed while scrolling on her phone, unaware that her husband, motivated by a wounded ego and a refusal to accept her independence, had decided to end her life, and that decision was executed with deliberate planning, a suppressor-fitted Glock, and a cold, calculated escalation that left no room for the defense's narrative of fear or self-preservation, as the prosecutor reminded the jury repeatedly that there was no legal justification, no imminent threat, no gun in Emily's hands, only the violence perpetrated by Ferlazzo, and that the killing was willful, deliberate, and premeditated, emphasizing that what Ferlazzo claimed in court, that Emily had pulled a gun, that he feared for his life, was a narrative invented after the fact, contradicted by his own prior statements, by forensic evidence, and by testimony from those who knew Emily intimately, who attested to her nonviolent nature and the impossibility of her wielding a firearm in that moment. And as the jury absorbed the prosecution's arguments, the defense attempted to pivot, arguing that over the course of their relationship, Emily had allegedly been physically aggressive, that Ferlazzo's actions were reactions to repeated provocations, that he acted in fear for his life, and that the jury should consider the impact of a volatile relationship on his state of mind. Yet the defense had little evidentiary support, calling only Ferlazzo himself, whose credibility was eroded by his shifting accounts and demonstrable lies, and whose demeanor, while attempting vulnerability, was interpreted by many as performative, self-serving, and manipulative. And the jury could see that his calm recounting of dismemberment and stabbing starkly contradicted the chaotic, panicked behavior one might expect in a claimed self-defense scenario, underscoring the prosecution's point that this was not a momentary lapse, but a series of deliberate, intentional, and horrifying actions, culminating in Emily's death, the trauma of her family, and the irreversible consequences of his decisions. And as closing arguments concluded, the prosecution reiterated that Ferlazzo's motivation was ego, his inability to accept his wife's autonomy, and that every element of his planning, execution, and concealment reflected consciousness of wrongdoing, while the defense urged the jury to consider fear, confusion, and self-defense, presenting Ferlazzo as a man cornered by circumstance and aggression. Yet the evidence offered little support for that claim, and the jury, instructed to consider fact over narrative, to weigh forensic evidence, witness credibility, and timelines, left the courtroom to deliberate, the room echoing with the gravity of responsibility and the human cost of the decision before them, the magnitude of Emily's life lost, and the deliberate choices that ended it. And in the tense hours that followed, every moment of deliberation was marked by the jurors grappling with these truths, examining the weight of the evidence against the claims of fear and self-defense, parsing through inconsistencies, examining the confessions, photographs, and forensic timelines, and ultimately returning to the reality that this was a calculated act of violence, carried out with a clear sequence of planning and execution, leaving no room for reasonable doubt, and after what must have been agonizing deliberation, the four persons stood, the room silent as the verdict was read. Joseph Ferlazzo was found guilty of first-degree murder, the culmination of a painstakingly detailed, emotionally charged, and morally compelling case. Justice for Emily affirmed, accountability established, and a community and family forced to begin. The long, painful process of healing, forever marked by the depth of human loss, the stark lessons of domestic violence, and the certainty that, in the eyes of the law, truth, evidence, and courage in testimony had prevailed against manipulation deceit, and an attempt to evade responsibility for one of the most brutal and senseless acts imaginable. The moment the jury's foreperson uttered the word guilty, the courtroom exhaled as one, a mix of audible gasps, tears, and restrained sobs filling the space, each sound carrying the weight of years of anxiety, grief, and disbelief, and, for Emily's family, friends, and loved ones, it was a release unlike any other, a confirmation that the legal system had finally acknowledged the deliberate, calculated, and monstrous actions of Joseph Ferlazzo. And yet, even in that relief, there was a profound sorrow, because justice, as real and as necessary as it is, could never restore the life that had been violently extinguished, could never erase the trauma etched into every memory, every photograph, every unfulfilled plan, every song Emily would never sing again. And the courtroom itself seemed to absorb the gravity of the moment, the collective consciousness of everyone present, from the seasoned attorneys who had argued tirelessly to piece together the narrative of a life cut tragically short, to the officers who had first encountered Ferlazzo and painstakingly collected the evidence, to the witnesses who had recounted moments of joy, love, and connection, alongside testimony about fear, violence, and deception, all converging to tell the story of Emily Fazzo, not just as a victim, but as a person, a young woman whose life had been rich with laughter, friendship, creativity, and energy, and whose absence left an unfillable void in the hearts of those who had loved her. And when her mother, through the haze of tears, spoke to the court and to the world about her daughter's vivacity, the depth of her loss, and the irreplaceable nature of Emily's presence, her words were simultaneously a tribute, a lament, and a testament, recounting Emily's passions for singing, for painting, for riding her bike, for dance, for being a loving sister and daughter, and as she softly sang, "Hallelujah." The haunting beauty of Emily's own voice, recorded years prior, resonated through the courtroom and in the minds of everyone watching, a reminder of what had been stolen, of the innocence and potential brutally taken from the world. And the juxtaposition of that song with the violence inflicted upon Emily's young body made the moment unbearably poignant, a fusion of art, life, and grief that cut to the core of human empathy. While outside the courtroom, the media coverage, social media tributes, and community reactions further amplified the collective mourning, painting a portrait of a young life that had touched many, and now, through tragedy, touched even more, and the legal outcome. With Ferlazzo sentenced to 42.5 years to life, taking into account the time already served, offered at least a measure of protection to the public, and a sense that the perpetrator would no longer be free to inflict harm, though it could never fully repair the fracture in the family's lives, nor bring Emily back to her friends who had shared countless memories with her, from inside jokes like the nicknames Minion and Group that encapsulated the depth of friendship, to the quiet moments of companionship, laughter, and support that defined her daily interactions. And each memory now carries a weight that is inseparable from grief, a bittersweet reminder of the vibrancy that once existed and the cruelty that ended it. And as the family reflected on the court sentence, they expressed cautious satisfaction, knowing that while nothing could undo the trauma, the outcome at least ensured that Ferlazzo would spend the majority of his life incarcerated, that society had formally recognized the severity and premeditated nature of his crime, and that future generations would not be endangered by his presence. Yet the emotional and psychological aftermath remained profound, not only for Emily's parents, siblings, and friends, but also for the law enforcement officials, prosecutors, and investigators who carried the weight of processing evidence so horrifying it challenged even the most seasoned professionals. From the meticulous examination of the camper van, saw, knives, and blood-stained trash bags, to the painstaking documentation of Ferlazzo's confession and subsequent lies, all of which required them to navigate the intersection of human cruelty and meticulous procedural rigor while maintaining objectivity, empathy, and professional integrity. And in interviews following the trial, prosecutors and detectives alike acknowledged the lasting impact of the case, speaking candidly about how Emily's death and the nature of the crime had changed them, leaving indelible marks on their personal and professional lives. And for those who had known Emily, the court proceedings, while providing closure, became a touchstone for ongoing grief and reflection, a constant reminder of the potential for darkness in human relationships, and the necessity of vigilance, support, and justice. And as the episode of Prime Crime concluded, the narrator reminded viewers of the fragility of life, the suddenness with which tragedy can strike, and the importance of awareness and safety while paying homage to Emily's memory, the enduring presence of her spirit, and the unbreakable bonds of family and friendship that continued to honor her life in the wake of unimaginable loss, underscoring that while justice may bring accountability, it cannot erase memory, love, or the profound human cost of violence, leaving the audience with both a sense of somber reflection and a stark awareness that, in the quiet moments of grief, remembrance, and storytelling, we preserve not only the facts of a case, but in spirit continue to echo, a testament to a life taken too soon and the enduring impact she had on everyone privileged to know her. And the episode ends with a call to remain safe, vigilant, and connected. A reminder that life is precious, that tragedy can strike without warning, and that honoring the lives lost is as much about justice as it is about memory, love, and the unbroken threads that tie us to those who are gone, yet remain forever present in our hearts.